Israel is doubling down on its critics, be it the International Criminal Court, which Benjamin Netanyahu calls anti-Semitic, or the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, which dares not to fall in line. Pakistan's government cracks down on political protests, throttles the flow of information. While in Bangladesh, reporters in the post-Sheikh Hasina era are reacquainting themselves with what it's like to do journalism. The ceasefire with Lebanon seems to be holding up for now, but Israeli bombs are still falling relentlessly on Gaza. That despite the International Criminal Court indicting Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his former defense minister Yoav Gallant for crimes against humanity. A warrant was also issued for Hamas's military commander, Mohammed Deif. Netanyahu reflexively dismissed the arrest warrants as anti-Semitic. So did much of the Israeli media. One notable exception was Haaretz, one of the few Israeli news outlets critical of the war on Gaza and the continuing oppression of Palestinians in the occupied West Bank. It's tough to call an Israeli newspaper anti-Semitic. So instead, Netanyahu's government announced an official boycott of Haaretz. No more state-sponsored ads, a move designed to squeeze the paper financially. From the outside, the walls appear to be closing in on Netanyahu. But he is a skilled operator, a survivor. And when the going gets tough, he knows how to muddy the waters, mess with the narrative. He also knows he can count on most Israeli journalists and the news outlets they work for to take his cues and run with them. 4 interviews done over Zoom, since 3 of the interviewees live in Israel, where Al Jazeera has been banned. 4 voices on the way the Israeli news media have covered the indictments issued by the International Criminal Court against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his ex-defense minister, Yoav Gallant, for war crimes.
For Israelis, what is actually being broadcast is like watching the army spokesman live on 24-hour repeat.
There's complete consensus in Israel that it's anti-Semitic, that it's all the nations are against us.
This feeds into their narrative rather than them examining what it is that they're doing.
It's not even that we reject the authority of the ICC. The message we wanted to send is that we don't care. We're doing our thing.
The Lebanese people felt the effects of that, as did the besieged Palestinians in Gaza. In the 4 days following the ICC indictments, Israeli bombs pounded Lebanese targets, which continued after the ceasefire was announced and until it went into effect, even as refugees were returning to their homes in the south. It was as if the Israeli military was mocking the court, which Benjamin Netanyahu had already targeted.
זהו צעד אנטישמי שיש לו מטרה אחת, להרתיע אותנו.
News outlets echoed the allegations of anti-Semitism, called for sanctions against the ICC, and bombarded their audiences with that angle.
זה אירוע כן אנטישמי חמור.
The court finds itself in good company. That same line has been leveled at human rights organizations, aid workers, journalists, the UN, just about anyone who dares to call out Israeli war crimes.
גופים שבמידה רבה מוטים על ידי הטיות אנטישמיות אפילו כנגד ישראל.
Anti-Semitism serves us perfectly because it's a very clear line, and you're either for us or against us. And if you're against us, you're an anti-Semite. It's just that simple. The longer this lasts, the longer we insist that the genocide we are carrying out in Gaza is not just necessary, but appropriate. The more simple we become, the less sophisticated we become. And the less sophisticated we become, the more immediate and self-serving is the trope of anti-Semitism.
For many Israelis, the fear of anti-Semitism and mixing that with any critique of institution is very ingrained, it's very deeply held. And then the other argument is, what about China? What about Russia? Why are they only going after us? Maybe because we're probably the only country that's committing genocide in broad daylight. More than 44,000 people killed in just over a year. That could be one reason why we are specifically being targeted.
This has a sort of long history in Zionism, It goes back to the Holocaust, the idea that the nations of the world did not help the Jews in their hour of need, and therefore we cannot trust them. So if they help us, they're good. But if they don't, or they criticize us, then we have to remind them of what happened during the Holocaust.
To introduce Omer.
What happens when the criticism comes from within? When the editor of the Haaretz newspaper, virtually the last moderate mainstream outlet left standing in Israel, describes Prime Minister Netanyahu this way.
It doesn't care about imposing a cruel apartheid regime on the Palestinian population while fighting the Palestinian freedom fighter that Israel calls terrorists.
Citing that speech and Haaretz's sometimes critical coverage of the war, the Israeli government cut ties with the paper, announcing it will no longer place ads in Haaretz, denying it a vital source of revenue. The paper reacted by likening Netanyahu to other leaders notorious for limiting freedom of the press in their countries. Having banned Al Jazeera from reporting from Israel 7 months ago, the Israeli authorities are now tightening their grip on the internal news narrative.
There had been conscious attempt from the government for a while to shut down Haaretz. So they were just looking for something like this to happen, and then Shokin said this, and then it just exploded. But Haaretz has been probably the only newspaper that brings testimonies from Gaza, that has reporters that actually talk about what's happening in Gaza and also in the West Bank.
This isn't a boycott in terms of giving interviews or access to government offices. That's not on the table. And the Israeli government doesn't talk to Haaretz that much anyway, even though I assure you, Haaretz is the first paper Netanyahu reads every morning. This is an attempt to go after Haaretz's finances. The government pays for all of these ads. And it's right out of the textbook for how to emerge as a fascist dictatorship 101.
Israel has long been a fascist state, at least towards Palestinians. It's now turning its fascism inwards towards those who actually consume Haaretz. It began with Al Jazeera because something like 75% of Palestinians consume Al Jazeera as their primary source of news. And it's been extended onto Haaretz is because they don't want to have any critique of Israel's carrying out these war crimes and genocide in Gaza, as well as war crimes in Lebanon.
Journalists in Israel constantly work under military censorship. To circumvent that, some reporters or sources will take sensitive information, feed it to news outlets outside the country, thus allowing Israeli journalists to report on it by attributing it to those organizations overseas. Last week, on the day the ICC indictment came down, news broke that one of Benjamin Netanyahu's aides had been indicted by an Israeli court for allegedly leaking a classified document to Bild, Germany's biggest selling paper.
מהחקירה עולה שפלדשטיין החליט להפיץ את המסמך הביטחוני המסווג לכלי תקשורת בישראל.
The resulting story, which surfaced in September, suggested Netanyahu wasn't the one preventing a deal to free the captives held by Hamas. Hamas's leadership was. Consider the timing. That story went out just after 6 Israeli captives had been found dead, and Netanyahu was feeling the heat. The suspicion, widely held, is that the story came out of what Israelis now call the poison machine. The operatives working under Netanyahu, in the shadows, misinforming Israelis, distracting them, and swinging news narratives in the Prime Minister's favor.
Now, everybody knows about the poison machine in Israel. The circle of advisors who surround Netanyahu and who provide the media with all kinds of half-truths meant to undermine any news outlet, put something against him. It's not a secret, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't work. And the extraordinary thing is that a leader of a state that was humiliated on October 7th, which was very much triggered by Netanyahu's own policies, his position has improved rather than deteriorated.
The very fact that Israeli media is talking about this, people are critical of Netanyahu about this, serves Netanyahu as well. Netanyahu wants this stuff to be front and center, because the more the Israeli public is talking about these details, the less the Israeli public is talking about the state of war, talking about the implosion of Israel as a result of this war. This is Netanyahu's method. He likes to have people obsess about very, very minor details, because that keeps them confused and too occupied to see the broader picture.
Then there are the Israelis who don't want to see the broader picture. It's a tech-savvy population, and regardless of the misinformation, sycophancy, and spin they're getting from their own news outlets, the truth is out there about the war crimes being committed in their name, if they're interested.
Israelis can get the same media that you and I and others are consuming. They can watch social media, they can see other outlets. Some can see Al Jazeera. They choose not to. Israelis prefer to keep their heads in the sand, denying the fact that they are carrying out a genocide. And just imagine how it's going to reflect in the future on not only the country, but the people who allowed this genocide to continue and didn't even bother questioning it when this is the only genocide that we know has been live streamed.
Pakistan is experiencing a deadly crackdown on political dissent. Its citizens just got a taste of the unprecedented grip the government now has over the flow of information. Ryan Kohls has been following this story.
These latest protests in support of Pakistan's jailed former Prime Minister Imran Khan began late last week when thousands of demonstrators marched on the capital, Islamabad, calling for his release. On Tuesday night, with the city under lockdown, the army and paramilitary forces dispersed the crowds using tear gas, rubber bullets, and live ammunition. At least 17 civilians and 6 security personnel were reportedly killed. But while protesters captured footage of the violence on their phones, its reach was severely limited. As with previous protests, the authorities initially imposed an internet blackout. What was different this time was that once the blackout was lifted, people in the city reported being unable to share photos or videos via WhatsApp. A report by Al Jazeera this week offered a clue as to why. According to sources at the Ministry of Defense and 2 internet service providers, Pakistan has deployed Chinese technology to create a so-called national internet firewall. Unlike blunt methods like internet blackouts, this new tool is designed to give the authorities greater control over what they can restrict, right down to specific features of applications. It's all part of a wider crackdown on freedom of speech since Imran Khan's removal from power in 2022 ignited widespread unrest. The social media platform X has been banned since protests back in February. Khan has been in prison for more than a year and faces more than 100 criminal charges, all of which he denies. Polls indicate he remains the country's most popular politician. His party, the PTI, has put the demonstrations on pause. With mainstream media in Pakistan already heavily censored, the new firewall is one more barrier standing in the way of the PTI's side of the story.
Thanks, Ryan. Next door to Pakistan, in Bangladesh, it's been 3 months now since a student uprising swept the country's authoritarian Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasina, from power. During her 15-year rule, Hasina and her party, the Awami League, criminalized political dissent, curtailed press freedom, censored news outlets, jailed journalists, or forced them into exile. With Hasina's departure, many news organizations that had persistently toed the line under her administration have started speaking truth to power. The interim government now in charge says it supports this rejuvenation of Bangladeshi journalism, that it actually welcomes criticism. Like any transition, however, challenges remain, from media owners eager to curry favor with the powerful to the lack of legal measures safeguarding media freedom. The Listening Post's Meenakshi Ravi now on the newly opened media space in Bangladesh and the prospect of lasting change.
When protests broke out in the capital of Bangladesh, Dhaka, in June this year, few could have predicted that within weeks, cities across the country would be in revolt, and that by early August, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, the woman who had governed for more than 20 years, would have fled.
প্রধানমন্ত্রীর পদ থেকে পদত্যাগ করে বিদেশে চলে গেছেন শেখ হাসিনা। আবারও বলছি, ছাত্র জনতার নজিরবিহীন আন্দোলনে শেখ হাসিনা পদত্যাগ করে দেশ ছেড়েছেন।
It was a rapid and seismic political upheaval. Overnight, the country's media did a 180-degree flip.
I remember on August 4, they were completely talking against the student movements, and they were saying that instead of students, the terrorists from political parties were leading the revolution. I mean, they were completely vilifying the student revolution.
সময় পরিক্রমা শিবিরের ব্রেন চাইল্ড এই আন্দোলন এখন সর্বজনীন গোটা সংস্কার আন্দোলন হলেও তাতে এখনো কলকাঠি নাড়ছে ছাত্র শিবির।
And on August 5th, I have seen a reporter saying that fascist Hasina has fled.
দর্শক, সকাল থেকেই কিন্তু শাহবাগ এলাকায় জড়ো হওয়ার চেষ্টা করছেন ছাত্রছাত্রীরা এবং নানা শ্রেণী পেশার মানুষ।
These media organizations were very closely allied with the previous regime, to the point where they almost became the de facto mouthpieces of the Awami League government. After Sheikh Hasina fell on August 5th, and you opened the newspapers, and every single front page called her a fascist, called her a dictator, called her regime authoritarian. You know, newspapers that we just didn't even think had that term in their vocabulary when it came to referring to her. It showed what a free media can really do.
In Sheikh Hasina's wake, Bangladeshi media outlets have flexed journalistic muscles that many thought had completely atrophied in the more than 2 decades of her government. There have been investigative pieces revealing what went down in the very last days that Sheikh Hasina was in the country, the orders she gave, and the eventual pushback that came from an army that knew she had to flee or risk being killed. Such intimate reporting of the former Prime Minister had long been one of the most stringent editorial red lines in the country. Journalists have also, unlike during the Hasina years, delved into the extent of government corruption.
রূপপুর পারমাণবিক বিদ্যুৎ কেন্দ্র থেকে $500 কোটি বেশি আত্মসাৎ করেছেন সাবেক প্রধানমন্ত্রী শেখ হাসিনা।
Fraud and cronyism in the corporate world is also more sharply in the spotlight. For example, conglomerates closely allied to the Hasina government, like the S. Alam Group.
This is a huge story. S. Alam Group became so powerful, and it's one of the closest ally of the then Prime Minister. It started using state security apparatus for hostile takeover of different organizations, including media. It took over Ekushe Television, which aired one of the speeches given by the opposition BNP leader who is in exile in London. Similarly, he took over 8 banks. Now reports are coming out that he took away almost $20 billion from these banks, and most of his money, actually, investment now is in abroad, not in Bangladesh.
I was one of the authors of one of the stories that you're talking about. And I want to tell you that our story was not extraordinary. It was really like a run-of-the-mill regular business story that any publication should be doing. But over here, this involved so much secrecy. It involved multiple layers of legal vetting. I honestly just think we did our duty.
The newspaper Zaima Islam works for is rare in Bangladesh. The Daily Star is a publication that pushed against media repression even during the Hasina years. The journalism the paper produced was matched by the work of just one other outlet, Prathom Alo. The 2 newspapers were the mainstream media holdouts during the many years in which Sheikh Hasina and her party, the Awami League, bent and then broke the media in the country. Media outlets that could not be co-opted were bought out by cronies. Systematic intimidation pushed journalists deeper and deeper under a pile of stories that were deemed taboo. They got calls from officials. Even the most meekly challenging journalists would be blacklisted from the Prime Minister's highly choreographed press conferences. Many journalists left the mainstream and moved online, and yet even they were amongst those kidnapped and disappeared by thugs paid off by the government. Those who were spared were ensnared by harsh media laws.
One usual tactic was to sort of deploy supporters to sue journalists and editors with multiple cases in various places in the country. The Daily Star editor had 82 cases against him. Pratham Alo editor had 56 cases. Amar Desh editor had even more, actually. And the tactics was to keep them busy in running around court corridors rather than focusing on journalism. The other way was when they were attending courts, they were harangued. Mahmoudur Rahman, Amar Desh editor, was actually physically assaulted and he was severely injured.
In the last 15 years, I mean, Sheikh Hasina as well her successive information ministers have been saying that the media landscape has evolved under her regime.
বাংলাদেশের গণমাধ্যম অনেক উন্নয়নশীল দেশের চেয়েও অবাধ স্বাধীনতা ভোগ করছে বলে মন্তব্য করেন তথ্যমন্ত্রী ডক্টর হাসান মাহমুদ।
I have lost counting of like how many newspapers got licensed, but the thing is like they were always maintaining this unwritten self-censorship. Firstly, because most of the businessmen were Hasina's beneficiaries. And then again, Hasina, her administration enacted laws like Digital Security Act, under which more than 200 journalists were implicated for crimes that didn't actually commit. So there's this sense of fear, and which again fueled the self-censorship.
In the days after the fall of Sheikh Hasina, the activists who had led the uprisings that toppled her sought out a new leader to oversee Bangladesh's transition into the post-Hasina era. The man they approached was Muhammad Yunus, economist, Nobel Prize winner, and once a victim of the former Prime Minister's political vendettas. The interim government Yunus leads has numerous challenges before it, not least a tortured media landscape.
It's beginning of unshackling. I wouldn't say that it's totally free now. It is free on the part of the government, but there are lots of score settling going on. Those who were victimized before now trying to take revenge, and that's one reason why you see allegations on harassments against pro-Awami League journalists.
The Yunus government, which is leading the interim administration right now, has said that they will not interfere in any way in obstructing media freedom. And I think they are true to their words.
সংবাদ মাধ্যম ও মত প্রকাশের পূর্ণ স্বাধীনতা ইতিমধ্যে নিশ্চিত করা হয়েছে। আমরা সবাইকে বলে দিয়েছি আপনারা মন খুলে আমাদের সমালোচনা করুন। আমরা সবার মতামতের প্রতি শ্রদ্ধাশীল। মিডিয়া যাতে কোনো রকম বাধা বিপত্তি ছাড়া নির্বিঘ্নে তাদের কাজ করতে পারে সেজন্য একটা মিডিয়া কমিশন গঠন করা সরকারের সক্রিয় বিবেচনাধীন।
But the owners, I mean the gatekeepers who are in the leading position of those media houses, they have this mindset of cowering down to power. They have this notion that okay, Bangladesh Nationalist Party will come to power if an election will take place, and they are not going to publish any stories that will earn them the ire of the BNP party.
A media landscape conditioned into fearing the worst from all quarters, be it those in power or those who might come to power. A country trying to come to terms with the abuses of its former Prime Minister. A citizenry wary of both politicians and the media. To call the situation in Bangladesh complex would be a significant understatement. And for the media there, how and whether reform takes place will be crucial to its future.
We need media that can thrive and survive despite who comes in power. This means an entire structural reimagining of what media ownership in Bangladesh looks like and what kind of legal safeguards there are for journalists. You protect the journalist from all forms of repercussion, all forms of reprisal, and you'll see the journalist truly living up to his or her potential.
And finally, after those international criminal court arrest warrants were issued, including the one against Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the Washington Post published an editorial that argued the ICC is somehow not the right venue to hold Israel to account. The piece contained plenty of falsehoods, deceptive arguments. It said the ICC had no jurisdiction over Israeli leaders. That is incorrect. Israel is not a member of the court, but Palestine is. So crimes committed there fall under the ICC's remit. The editorial said Israel's, quote, vibrant, independent media will do its own investigations, which, as anyone who has been watching the Israeli media can tell you, is simply not based in reality. The Post raised the point again that Israel is an island of democracy in a regional sea of dictatorships. That argument ignores what rights groups call a state of apartheid, a democracy for Israeli Jews only. In fact, much of what the op-ed said has already been contradicted by the paper's own reporting on the war on Gaza. Still, the Post's brain trust published it. That editorial will not age well. Defending alleged war criminals seldom does.